Welcome to the Energy Policy Now podcast from the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Stone. Global agriculture changed dramatically during the 20th century as small traditional farms were replaced by large monoculture farming in many parts of the world. The result has been a dramatic increase in food production, helping to feed a global population that today exceeds 8 billion. Yet the revolution in agriculture has created a new set of challenges. Modern farming is more resource-intensive than ever, requiring substantial investments in equipment and technology and reliance on inputs like chemical fertilizers. These changes expose farmers to new types of economic risk. And in many areas of the globe, the advent of bulk cash crops has come at the cost of soil quality and the nutritional value of the food we grow. On today's podcast, we'll explore the tension between modern agriculture and its impacts on environment, nutrition, and farming economics with Lindiwe Majele Sibanda. Lindiwe is a professor of agriculture at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and a cattle farmer in Zimbabwe. She is also board chair of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, a global partnership of agricultural research centers focused on food security. She'll explore current efforts to further improve farming by revisiting traditional crops and adopting practices that may lower reliance on fossil fuels, enhance soil management, and offer climate benefits. Lindiwe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So you have a very broad resume. You are a research professor, a cattle farmer, and board chair of CGIAR. What has been the focus of your research and your work with that organization?
My work with CGIAR is really about the governance of a system. CGIAR, as you know, is a grouping, a partnership of 13 centers plus 2 others.
And those are agricultural research centers?
And these are all agriculture research centers. What are we working on? We have a common vision to transform food systems, land systems, water systems in the face of climate change, all in an effort to make the world food secure and nutrition secure.
So that is to improve or change agricultural processes in light of the added pressures of climate change.
Yeah, I like the way you say agriculture processes. We like to talk more about food systems. And the difference between the two is that in 2021, a big change that came into our world is that we moved from just agriculture into food systems. And food systems talks about from farm to fork. Previously, agriculture was just concentrated around inputs that come to the farm and production on farm. Now we move out of the farm into harvesting, storage, processing, distribution, and consumption at household level. So in our centers, our focus is food systems, from the farm to the fork, which is what people eventually eat.
So the whole chain from start to finish to the table.
Exactly. But more important, focusing on the nutritional quality of what we produce. It's no longer just about commodities. Corn is a commodity, wheat is a commodity. It's more, what are we doing in the food system space for people to consume nutrient-dense foods?
So as you just mentioned, you work at the intersection of nutrition, environment, and also the economic viability of farming for farmers. And a lot has changed over the last century in terms of farming practices. But before we discuss the issues and the challenges that has brought us to, and it's gone through what we've called the green revolution of the past century, could you tell us a little bit about what traditional farming looked like? And I understand that you grew up on a farm in Zimbabwe that looked much more like farming used to look than it does today.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what that was like and how things have changed.
That brings a lot of smiles to my own face because it takes me back to my grandmother Gogo Mayembe's farm in Zimbabwe, like Loaguero village. What was unique about that farm in the 60s, like many other smallholder farms then, it's a 1 hectare farm, but that farm served as my grandmother's nutrition garden. It served as a food garden. It served to feed her for income, to feed her family, and we fed the soil. That's how she looked at it. But most important, she called it her pharmacy because all the herbs that kept us healthy came from that farm. Now that speaks to diversity. Can you imagine a 1-hectare farm that produces all the cereals we needed for our staple? And our staple was corn, and it still is corn for most of Zimbabweans. But in addition to corn, we had sorghum, we had millet, and there was this special variety of sweet sorghum which you could harvest from the field and just chew and get your sugar from it continuously. That's for cereals. We also had beans, 3-4 varieties of beans on the same farm. We had vegetables. We had fruit trees, mangoes, pawpaws. The most common fruit there was guava, which we could harvest anytime when they were in season. But most important, we had livestock. We had free-ranging chickens. We had goats. And every time we came as grandchildren from the city to visit grandma, a goat was slaughtered for us to eat. So we were spoiled. We had meat every day, but it was less than 20 grams per person per day. The rest was the vegetables and the cereal from the garden. We also had a dairy cow. 1 dairy cow, and that's where we got our milk, and my grandmother was big in making cottage cheese. So you can imagine the diversity in our diet. Sweet potatoes for breakfast. For lunch, we would have the sorghum meal, and for dinner, we would have the corn meal with diverse types of vegetables and protein sources.
So that was plenty. That was a very well-balanced
diet. Diverse diet, and not only fed the grandchildren, but my grandmother's 6 children. So we had enough from just on 1-hectare farm.
Modern agriculture, monoculture, has replaced a lot of that traditional farming that you've just described over the last, again, century or so. What drove that change? What problems was it trying to solve, particularly given that you've just said that you had this farm that really provided everything that was needed?
Yeah. So Gogo Mayembe's farm, the grandmother farm I described, was really a subsistence type of production. Schooling was close to free. Medical hospitals were for free. But things changed. There was now demand for income. And the push was to get your income from the resource that you had, which is the land. In Asia, it was different. They had mass starvation in the 60s, early 60s, 63, 64, 65. And Swaminathan, who is the father of the Green Revolution, linked up with Norman Borlaug, who was a scientist working out of Latin America, and they produced hybrid, high-quality seeds that would increase the yield. But that increase in yield meant that you needed more fertilizers, you needed more water, a way of irrigation, but also pesticides to deal with the diseases that were associated with accelerated growth.
So those new crops couldn't handle diseases if they weren't indigenous to a particular area? Is that what's happening?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But all that had been researched, and it was a heavily mechanized system. Mm-hmm. It was good for farmers. It did boost the income of farmers. It achieved food security. But that food security was mainly in terms of calories. Mm-hmm. They were able to produce wheat without the wheat rust, which was an endemic disease in the area. All that was good as long as people were fed. But fast forward 20 years later, we got a challenge where the soils were denuded of their nutrients. It was the same crops over and over again that were extractive in terms of the nutrient quality of the soils. Most important, people were malnourished. They were fed, but they were not nourished because the food did not have the diversity. No one food can meet the requirements of our bodies. You need a diverse diet. Second, the foods that were produced were not nutrient dense. That led to malnourished soils, malnourished people, but worst, it was the impact on the environment. Can you imagine all that fertilizer and the emissions that were released from the excess fertilizer that was flowing into the soil and also into the waterways? So we woke up to a situation where Green revolution on its own is not good enough. Asia moved to an evergreen revolution. And luckily, Swaminathan, who turns 100 years this year, was still alive to recognize that damage and began the push towards evergreen revolution, which is going back to planting the pulses which had been removed for monoculture for high-yielding cereals. So we need the diversity. We are almost going back to what my grandmother had, but now with more diverse crops, which have been researched to produce more for less.
I want to talk about that evergreen revolution in a moment, but just going back, so basically what the situation was is you had monocrops coming in.
Yep.
The crops themselves weren't diverse enough to provide all the nutrients that people needed. Plus, you had depleted soils from the practices that, I guess, reduced the amount of nutrients that were inherent in the foods that were available, and that was really bad for providing people the nutrition that they needed. Another element that you just mentioned a few minutes ago was the economics of farming. And this changed the economics of farming for farmers, made them more tied into the broader economic system for good and for bad. What was the impact of that?
Well, with farming is tough, and you've got to do your maths to break even. So if you get a crop that doubles your yields, it means more money in the pocket. And as I said, for my grandmother, it was feed your pocket, feed your family, and feed the soil. But what that green revolution did was to feed the pocket, but not feed the earth and not nourish the people. What does that money do? This is how you move from low to middle income. The people are now able to afford protein-dense foods from the supermarkets. They were able to buy cheese. They were able to buy animal source foods like meat, which previously would have been beyond their reach. They were able to afford cars. I'll speak about my own village. Once you have made it and have had a good income in a good agriculture season, you move from sitting on the floor when you eat to a dining room table. You move from a handset radio to a television set. You move from sleeping on the floor to buying beds for your family. And that is the measure of development. That's the aspiration in a village for every farmer. But most important, you start paying for good quality education for your children.
Now, if the farms fail or don't produce as much, then you're also tied into that economic system as well.
So it's not only failure at the farms, it's really a transition. Not everybody makes it.
Mm-hmm.
Like any technology adoption, there are the early starters who get it and they rise up the ladder. But there will always be those laggards who are still on a 1 hectare farm, are not producing enough, cannot buy the high quality seeds. Because remember, my grandmother used to keep her best quality seeds from her own farm and replant them. But with these high quality hybrid seeds, you have to buy them and you cannot replant them. When you replant, the yields nosedive downwards. Now, it's not going to be for everybody to adopt that technology. And not everybody can afford the fertilizer requirements that are prescribed for the soil. So there's always going to be people who make it through agriculture. Those are the lead farmers in any village. And then there are those who just get maybe just one bucket of corn per year. And the rest of the time they're dependent on food aid or some support. So technology is what drives improved productivity. And the challenge has always been, how do you help farmers access affordable technology? And that's where the issue of smart subsidies comes in. To introduce a technology, farmers are averse to risk, but if a few adopt it and showcase that it works, others will latch on, but there will still be those who can't afford, and you want them to all access. So governments, through policy, introduce what is called smart subsidies, which is subsidized new technologies with a plan to withdraw once farmers have made enough income and are able to finance the next season.
I want to take a step back here for just a moment and talk about climate change and its impact. You mentioned that also a few minutes ago. And climate change is something that is frequently in the news, that it affects particularly developing areas of the world, most noticeably. What impacts are you seeing on your farm, in the areas that you work, that are a result of climate change, and what challenges are these presenting for farmers and food systems generally?
The one reason I've remained a farmer is that it has humbled me to relate to the science we generate and to understand how difficult it is for farmers on the ground to prepare and to produce food. 5 years ago, we had our worst nightmare in Zimbabwe on my farm, where I lost about 20% of our cattle because we didn't get enough rain and our water storage ran out. And there's nothing as painful as having an animal come and push the fence, the boundary to your homestead, because they can see a tap that you've got on for your drinking water. Can you imagine a herd of 100 animals surrounding your homestead, bellowing away to say, give us water, give us water? We lost some, but I was lucky I was able to transport some of the animals to my father's farm.
Was that type of drought unprecedented?
It was unprecedented, but wait until you hear about last year. 2024 season, we had El Nino. The good thing about that season, even though it was the worst in living memory in the past 15 years, was that we were warned. Our early warning systems came into effect. And for most farmers, when we get that, we're like, did they get it right? But I was smart. For once, I reduced my herd by 50%. And that's the best thing I did. We ran out of water. All the crops failed, and we did not have sufficient water. But luckily, because I had reduced the herd, we had sufficient to meet, though rationed, the animal requirements. They did not have the luxury of ad libitum drinking, but at least we had sufficient to keep them alive. We did not experience any deaths. In other farming areas, mortality was up to 100%, just because animals had no water. The feed was a problem, but you can ship in feed. You can buy food from other areas and bring it in. How do you ship in water when your animal needs 100 liters per day? It's just impossible. So those are the challenges we've come head on with. My head has gone down. I'm not complaining because I could have lost through death, but we can build better. And this year, 2025 season, is one of the best I've had in the last 20 years. So farming is a risk, and unless you have climate mitigation strategies, one of them is investing in water harvesting, but also having irrigation systems, because a rain-fed system is the most risky type of farming. And unfortunately, irrigation coverage for most of Africa is no more than 5%. Most people depend on rain-fed systems. And that's why the impact of climate change is heaviest, because you are not ready to mitigate the risk. And we need more investment in irrigated systems.
There has been an arc of development in agriculture, and it goes from these very diverse farms, the rainbow farm, as you've called it, that you grew up on, to much larger plots, monoculture farms. And now, looking forward to meet needs of nutrition and the environment and managing the soil, the idea is to move back to something known as opportunity crops. At least that's kind of the current buzzword.
Yeah.
Tell us what the opportunity crops are. Is it simply just going back to the way things were on your grandmother's farm, or does it look a little different than that?
Yeah. But Andy, before I go into opportunity crops, I spoke about water being a challenge during drought years as a result of climate change. One of the things that have hit us hard is diseases. We are experiencing new diseases in our livestock that we have never known. And as a result, we don't have the vaccines that are relevant. Your health management system shoots over the roof because you have to vaccinate more. But unfortunately, even the vaccines we are using are not effective because we don't know what we're dealing with. And no wonder we are dealing with antimicrobial resistance, because farmers are just jabbing the animals just to try and catch up with the diseases. All that is because we've got extreme heat and extreme humidity at times. And it's just a yo-yo. You just don't know what's in store and how to deal with it. And all that is the effect of climate change.
Well, you brought up a very interesting point also in a talk that you gave here at the university yesterday. You said the costs for farmers are going up for inputs, for fertilizers, for pesticides and herbicides, for vaccines, for cattle, but the price at market is the same.
This is the most difficult time to be a farmer, and the only reason I'm staying on the farm is the passion. When I get to the farm, I just feel happy. But in terms of profits, we are not breaking even because everything is just gone so expensive and we are not ready for it. We just need a new system that we understand better that will deal with the hazards that have been created by climate change.
So if the new is the old being these opportunity crops, potentially solving some of these problems, tell us what this looks like. Again, is it going back to the way things were, or is it taking part of what was traditionally used?
So what's exciting about this opportunity crops, thanks to Ambassador Kerry Fowler, who used to be the special envoy for global food security under the U.S. government, but an ambassador for the whole world. He is an animal breeder. He looked back and said, we are relying on a very few crops when we are sitting on gene banks where we've been collecting anything to do with crops, to do with livestock, to do with fish. Why aren't we going back to those gene banks and looking for crops that are nutrient dense, that are climate smart, but can also feed the soil? We did that thanks to Kerry, who appointed me as his inaugural co-chair, together with a colleague, Namukolo, from the International Livestock Research Institute. And we divided the task into two. Can we look into our gene banks and look for crops that are nutrient dense? With support from the United Nations Food Agriculture Organization, we did that mapping and came up with a catalog. The next thing was, with that catalog, can we go one by one and do climate modeling and do predictions? If it gets very hot, if it's a drought year, how do these crops behave? Thanks to Cynthia Rosenwein, who is a World Food Prize laureate, who did the modeling for us. And we came up with a robust list of crops such as okra, crops such as fonio, your millet, your sorghum, your cassava, all the crops, sweet potato that my grandmother had on her farm, but now my children have not tasted them. Why? Because there's been no investment in research. People still produce them, but not in sufficient quantities because the yields are limited and they can only feed the household for less than 20 days. So they don't make it to the market. So the thrust is, can we invest, put more money into research, just like we did for corn, like we did for wheat, like we did for the livestock, the high-yielding livestock that we now have? Put the same energy of investment into these opportunity crops because they hold the answer for nourishing people, nourishing the soil, and being climate smart. So that's the new catalog we are presenting to the world, and the host institution within CGIAR that is driving the VAX initiative, it's called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils for Africa, is CIMIT, which is based in Mexico, in partnership with FAO.
Yesterday in this same talk, you said something that caught my attention. You said that we're no longer in the commodity game when we're dealing with agricultural products here. Does that mean or imply that food production is sufficient to meet global demand, number one, at this point? And two, you just started to talk about it. Yep. If we switch to some of these more traditional crops, that food demand will still be met.
Yep. So the big question is always, how do we feed close to 10 billion? Estimates are that 9.7, 9.8 billion by 2050. There are different ways we can do that. First, we can go on increasing the yields per hectare. Africa is one continent that's been left behind because it never experienced the green revolution. So there's still that gap, but let's do it in a smart way. Don't do it the extractive way where you denude the soils of their nutrients. Close the gap in a sustainable way. Number two, we can do it by reducing food loss and waste. Currently, close to 30-40% in some areas of the food that's produced goes to waste. In Africa as well, it goes to waste because we don't have the cold chain. We don't have the post-harvesting technologies. In most cases, the food is harvested, is put on an ox-drawn or donkey-drawn cart. As you're driving to the household, it is dripping all the way. When you get to the storage facilities, there are all sorts of insects that have their party on the food. And when it's taken to the city, the roads are so poor that there is spoilage on the way to the market. So improving roads and infrastructure will reduce food loss and waste. There is also waste at household level. How many things expire in your refrigerator and find their way into the bin?
Way too much.
Because you've just picked what you don't need to eat from the supermarket and you're like, look, this has expired, throw it away. So increase productivity in a sustainable way, reduce food loss and waste, but most important, diversify the diet. It's amazing how many people are malnourished. Malnourished as they're in obesity or in stunting, two extremes. You are stunted from birth because your mother during pregnancy was not well nourished, and in the first 2 years of life, no one is giving you nutrient-dense foods to reverse any deformations. As a result, after 2 years, you cannot reverse that. Now, the challenge and the sad thing is that if you fail to arrest the stunting in the first 2 years of life, you end up with permanently stunted children. And the sad thing is that those children, the brain is not well developed. We have countries where we have stunting rates of 35-40%. Can you imagine 30-40 years from now, leaders who have underdeveloped brains, what that country and what our own world will look like? So nutrition is the biggest challenge we are grappling with. Not just nourishing the soil, but nourishing our bodies. It will cut down the health cost. For adults, we are dealing with non-communicable diseases like hypertension from our high salt and high sugar diets, high fats. We are also dealing with diabetes, which is all a non-communicable diseases that can be influenced to a large extent by the diets that we eat. Of course, lifestyle and genetics come in, but diet plays a major component. Back to your question, what do we want to do to feed the close to 10 billion people by 2050? We want to be responsible under a sustainable food system that produces food that nourishes the soil, that nourishes the people, and nourishes the environment. We want healthy people, healthy animals, and a healthy environment.
What if you could explain to me, I'm trying to visualize what these farms might look like. So you described the 1 hectare farm of your grandmother. In the United States, we often think of, in the context of vast, wheat and cornfields in the Midwest of this country. The farms that would grow some of the more traditional crops, would those look something more like a very diverse farm, a smaller farm, or are we talking again about the large monoculture kind of farms, but with different types of crops on them?
So farmers ask us with this question, what do you do? And the big movement that is on fire now is the regenerative agriculture movement. Mm-hmm. What are we saying? We are saying biodiversity must be conserved, water stewardship on the farm, soil quality is key, crop rotation is also key, and minimum disturbance of the soil. So there is a catalog, a checklist of what regenerative agriculture is. And I always joke and say it reminds me of what my grandmother did. It was diverse crops all on 1 hectare, rotation where she had beans, she would put cereals the following year, but always after harvest would leave sufficient soil cover to protect the soil. And where we didn't need to deep plow, we cultivated and just did minimum soil disturbance before we plant it. So we are going back to holistic management systems, and regenerative agriculture is the new push now as we embrace this more for less.
You mentioned some of the transportation challenges and some of the storage challenges, lack of refrigeration, that type of thing, that are often a problem. I want to ask you about the energy implications of the change that we're talking about. Transportation still has to take place. Food has to be stored. And also there's inputs, right? Nitrogen fertilizers, use of ammonia to produce those fertilizers. All this requires energy. What does this mean for energy systems, particularly at their intersection with the agricultural sector?
Agriculture in itself is the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and we are aware that there's a lot you can do on the farm. First is really the emissions from the soil, and I've spoken about soil conservation. But improved productivity means mechanization, and mechanization means more tractors on the farm, and the tractor is for plowing, is for disking, is for application of fertilizer, is for harvesting, is for processing. It runs the farm. My own farm at the moment is fully off-grid. We've been able to put solar, but the challenge is the initial capital investment for that move. So affordability of the technologies on the shelves remains a challenge. We're trying biogas. It's not easy. The quantities and the technologies are not yet fully farmer-friendly and affordable to be taken en masse. And I think this is where we need policies and subsidies that will help farmers to go green and yet remain not just sustainable economically, but also environmentally and socially. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And unfortunately, bottom line is that there's need for more investment. Technologies are there, but really not yet affordable for the farmers. So in terms of energy efficiency, the other way would be to look at the inputs that come onto the farm. I sit on a farm where I've been told 300 kilograms of nitrogen fertilizer per hectare per year. Now, the question is, does every piece of land require the 300? Isn't there a better way of precision measurement where I use the right amount of fertilizer, not just nitrogen, the right quantity, at the right time? All that is technology that has to be generated through testing of my soils, through research, and through knowledge that's then brought on farm. All that would help in terms of the runoff, the excess fertilizer that causes the damage that we want to avoid. But the bottom line is, unless we invest in research and development and generate technologies that are specific for agroecological conditions, we will be talking blanket solutions. And a farmer is clever. They won't just adopt they will try things, and if they are not affordable, if they are not sustainable, they'll just say, I'm better off with what I've always done. So there's a lot that needs to be done to address the challenge of energy security on farm, but also all technologies in general.
Sticking with the topic of climate here for a moment, you have a cattle farm in Zimbabwe that you've spoken about, and I believe you've been involved with some research to reduce the methane emissions from livestock. They're a major source of methane. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, unfortunately, whenever you say you're a livestock farmer, everybody says, really? Because livestock has been made synonymous with climate change bad. It is not that bad. Yes, livestock produce methane, and the bad thing about the methane is that it's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. What that means is that we have to try and reduce it because it stays longest in the atmosphere. We will not win the climate war without winning the methane war. And that is why a lot is going into research to find out how do we breed animals that emit less methane? How do we arrest the production of methane in the rumen, the tummy of the animal? There are different technologies that have come up. There are some that are feeding specific feeds that are low methane emission foods. There are ways of additives that can be added into the feed to make sure that it does not produce as much methane. There are ways of dealing with the manure that's produced. We're dealing with the methane from belching and gas emission, but also there's greenhouse gases that come from the excreta from the animals. So the International Livestock Research Institute, which is headquartered in Nairobi and Addis Ababa, is seized with exactly that question. Can we find foods that lead to less methane emission? Can we find production systems? We are working across 3 systems. There is the pastoral system, where animals are free-ranging in the Horn of Africa, right up to West Africa, the Fulani. There is the semi-extensive system, whereby animals get top-up of feed. There is the mixed livestock crop system, where animals rely on crop residues. After we've harvested, we feed to our animals. All those 3 systems we have discovered have different emission levels of methane. How do we work around those systems to minimize the methane emissions? All this is research that is ongoing. Unfortunately, the new results that we have are technologies from additives which are expensive. You do not want a technology that will bump up the price of milk, the price of beef for the farmer. You want a technology you can take to scale that will allow affordable products to be produced. And that's where the dilemma is. Some of them that have been discovered are poisonous, good, but now, thanks to AI, we can go to our gene banks and look for a particular type of plant or nutrient within a plant that we can extract and use as an additive to make sure we suppress the methane production. So that's all the exciting research. And to me, what was exciting was that we could even breed animals that are low methane emitters. So all that has been unraveled by science, and our center is seized with trying to make these technologies available in an affordable, scalable manner, particularly for smallholder farmers. But the issue of methane is big even for large producers. We have to fight that war and win it if we are going to make a mark in terms of climate mitigation.
A few minutes ago, we did talk about, if this next revolution in agriculture will produce enough food to feed the world. We're looking at protein in particular, lots of inputs, high costs, lots of land demands as well. Will we have enough protein in the future?
That's a good one. The Green Revolution was calorie, calorie, calorie. That's why it fed people and did not nourish them. When we talk nourishment, we are looking for, yes, energy, but we are looking for protein-dense foods, but also micronutrients, your vitamins and minerals. And I believe we are yet to achieve a protein revolution. We do not have sufficient affordable protein in the world. If you look at the environment I grew up in, I could afford 20, 40 grams of meat a day. We could drink a cup of milk every day. Not everyone has access to that because of poverty levels that have gone up. We already have millions more than 800 million people going to bed hungry every day. When we say hungry, we just mean food. Can you imagine how protein hungry those people are? So what should we be doing? Yes, we should be doing the research that the International Livestock Research Institute is doing on more animals. Already the demand has gone up for eggs, for milk, for meat, particularly pigs, chicken, and of course beef. If you look at the 10 most traded commodities in the world, 5 out of those 10 are animal source foods. That means with increasing incomes, more people are wanting to eat eggs, milk, and meat. But what do we do for the poor? What do we do for the majority who can't afford those animal source foods? That's why, for me, I don't shy away from supporting the protein-based meats that are coming up. We need to fill the gap, and any technology that is sustainable, doing less harm to the environment, that is going to close the protein deficit gap should be welcome. And it promotes diversity. Nourishment is about diverse diets, and let's open up space for that diversity, and plant-based proteins have space in nourishing the world.
Lindiwe, thank you very much for talking.
Thank you very much.
Today's guest has been Lindiwe Majele-Sibanda, Board Chair of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. For more podcasts, as well as energy policy research, blogs, and events, visit the Kleinman Center website, where you can also sign up for our monthly newsletter. Our web address is kleinmanenergy.upenn.edu. Thanks for listening to Energy Policy Now, and have a great day.